Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Kelvin again, and where did we leave off in our little project here? So inside of main, we created the config, the database connection, as well as the service and controller for threads. So this video, we're definitely going to finish out the replies portion of our application. But before we go ahead and do that, let's open up our router because I think, there's something I want to do first. So right now, our gin router is being set up in the new here, but we don't have any defaults. So our router only has the logger and also the release mode, but this is only for production. So what I want to do is inside of routes, we're going to make a new function called setup defaults. And this is just to add some more configuration to our router, the gin portion of our router. Specifically, it's called the engine. And this is just to give us some more niceties to our router. For example, we want to use a middleware called gin recovery. And what recovery means is that whenever our server hits an error, it's going to immediately shut down. But recovery will allow us to recover from that error and just start over. So it'll restart our server whenever it reaches an error point. But in addition to that, gin also gives us a nice little method called noRoute, which takes in a function. And this function is going to be pretty familiar if you can kind of sense the pattern. It'll take in the gin context and we'll just return a JSON output. So we'll do c.json here, and then we can just create an error using the utility functions that we added in the last video. So create API error, status not found. So this is going to be our 404 number. And then also the error, we can just give it a message of no route found. So this handler is just like all the other handlers that we've been creating inside of our controller. And lastly, I want to create a get endpoint to the root path. So that'll be /API/, which this also takes in a function using the context from gin, status okay, and gin.h health okay. Alright, I kind of glossed over this, but what this is the health check. I don't think we need this ending slash. What a health check is just the endpoint that checks if the server's up and running. It's a little redundant when we're running it locally, but it's useful when it's deployed and you just hit the server path. But all it means is that our app is alive. So it's kind of helpful and it's nice to have. Now you'll also notice that I didn't attach this to the underlying router, and that's because we're going to send in the gin router as a parameter, mostly because in the constructor method, I don't want to have a struct method that we have to call inside of the constructor. It'll just be easier and kind of easier to read that we're applying a function to the underlying engine. If that's confusing, what I mean is we'll just call setup default like this and send in the R here, which will then mutate the gin router before we instantiate our private router down here. Right now we can move on to our replies and stuff. And we're gonna go back to the routes file just so I can show the intended path for register reply routes. Now this is gonna take in a controller reply controller, which doesn't exist right now. That's why I commented out. But the router group here is going to be API/replies/TID for thread ID. And most of the same routes are going to be present in the reply routes. So we can copy these and paste them here. Now, of course, none of these will work because we don't have a controller as a dependency yet. We need to go make that. But as you can see, we'll have two route params. We'll have the ID of the reply, which we need for the get, put, and delete routes. And then we'll also have the parent ID, which is the thread ID here. Now, originally, I wanted it to be something like /ID, thread ID, /replies/ID. The problem is it'll overwrite the ID variable name because we need two IDs, and we're already using ID here for the thread. And I didn't want to add it in again. So we're just gonna go with this method instead. And with that explanation, we can go ahead and create our reply stuff. We're gonna start with the service, but before we do that, I'm gonna comment all of this out and do that little thing with the print line so that our code can compile if we end up compiling it. But inside of service, we need a reply service.go, which is inside of the package of services. And we're gonna do that same pattern again with a public interface, a private struct, a constructor method that returns the public interface, which is actually a pointer or a reference to the private interface or struct. And the dependency here is the database connection, which we will call db. So that'll be get, and that means needs to be here. The type is gorm.db. Now the next step is to fill out the interface with all the methods that we want to do. And I recommend, if you're still kind of fuzzy with the implementation, to write it all out. But if you're just really lazy, you could go ahead and open up the thread controller. As most of the implementation is the same, we just need to change some letters and variable names. So first, I'm going to take these, put them over here, change the model over. The list method is going to be different in that we're going to call it list by thread ID, and we're going to provide the TID as well, because we're going to get all by a certain parent ID, and that's why we need to do that. Now I'm going to copy delete with password, reports, and create because they're almost identical. Paste them in the reply service. The biggest change here is that we're going to change all the T's to R's, and it'll look like this. So I'm going to go down with report and delete with password because those are the most automatically samey. I'm going to come back to create later because there's actually some changes. In fact, I'm going to get rid of it so that you don't see it. I'll just leave it like that. Okay, now get by ID is this one here, which is also almost exactly the same. Now with all of those, let's go into the ones that are new, and we're going to start with list by thread ID. And hopefully you aren't lost on the screen and we're on this line right here. So ignore what's below for now. But first we're going to make a variable so that we can hold our end result for the reply list. Calculate the page, or calculate the offset based on the page. So the offset is page -1 unless page is 0, in which case offset is 0. And then we'll generate the result using the database, doing a find where we provide the reference to our reply model. And then after that, we'll return result.error as well as the reference to our model. So far, nothing too crazy, but we're gonna need to add a where clause here where we can provide the parent ID of, which is the thread ID. So that will be TID here. And that should do it for our list by thread ID. And that'll get all of our replies. Now on to create, which is gonna be a massive thing on its own. And I'll explain why in a bit. But let's start with hashing the password because that's not too different. So we need to get a new password based on the model that's provided from the delete password. Check the error, so if error not nil, we'll return the error, and then nil for the reply model because it's a pointer, so it could be nothing. And that means we could do a reassignment to the delete password with the new password. Now there's a new thing that we need to do, and that's the relationship with the thread ID. Now TID here is being supplied as a string, so we need to do that string conversion thing, which is string conversion A to I of TID. Do the error checking thing, return error or nothing. And this is doing a reassignment to the thread ID of the reply model. Oh, right. So what thread ID here, the type is of int, and what thread ID is expecting on the reply model is an unsigned int. Luckily, they're compatible types, so we can just do a casting here, which essentially means that we're changing the number into another number, which is something you can do inside of Go, so that's helpful. Now, the next thing we need to do is a transaction, and this is going to be the big bulk of create here. And if you remember, we did transactions in report as well as delete password. So it'll look similar to this, except we're not doing an immediate return. We're actually going to do service.db.transaction and then provide the function in here of type gormdb, which gives us an error. No, just one error. And then we'll do the multiple different SQL operations inside of it. But the return of the create is going to be similar in that we'll just return the transaction, which could possibly be an error, and then the pointer, or not, the reference to R. And that'll work because we're going to be mutating what is held in that reference while we're inside of the transaction. Let's just add a return nil at the bottom so I don't need to worry about that. But first, we need another temporary variable that is for t, which is the thread. So models.thread. And that's because the first query that we're going to be running is to look for that specific thread and t. And this is actually TID. And if an error exists, we'll return result.error. So before I do the next two operations, let me explain. Essentially, when we do a create on replies, we're doing an update on threads. And that way, when we do a list on threads, we get all the newest threads first, and that's taking into account the replies that are on that thread. So after we do the find, we can do a create. And this is the main error that we want to error out if this transaction fails, so that we never update the parent thread. And also the reason why we do a where here is just to make sure that we get a resource that exists. So you can't create a reply if the parent doesn't exist. And then finally, after we do the create, we can then do an update on the parent thread. And the updated column is bumped on with the new value of time.now. And let me just scroll down so you can see all of that. It's a very long if statement. But that finishes out our create method. And then let's scroll down so that you can see both report and delete, just in case you didn't already have those. So to review, report is we find it if it exists, then we do an update on reported, changing it to true because by default it's false. Delete with password is the same flow, except we're doing a password check in between the find and update. Okay, now we just need to scroll up. So we're getting an error here because I messed up the parameters of create. This actually needs the thread ID for the whole thing that we created earlier. No, that didn't fix it. I forgot to change this to reply. There we go. Let's go to thread service now. We only need to make one update, and that is inside of both list and get. It's one of the reasons why I broke up the query like this, and that's because we want to preload. That's actually the method that we're going to use. But we want to add in the relationship of replies if it exists. And for preload, it just takes in another gormdb function where we're returning the query on the reply object of the thread object. So what this db is referring to is the replies that's embedded on the larger thread. But all I want to do is just limit this to 10. We don't want our API result to be ridiculously long. In the case that one thread has like 1,000 replies, we don't want to fetch all of them. So it makes sense to add a limit here, but we don't want to also add like actual pagination stuff because we'll just direct the user to the reply endpoint because that's what it's for. Now we can also take this preload method in part of the chain and add it to the get down here. So I'll just add it there, and that'll add the replies whenever replies exist. As a review, our thread model, we have the omit empty option on the JSON tag. So if we have an empty replies, it just won't render it. Okay, the only thing we need to do now is create a controller for our replies. Reply controller.go. And the reply controller is an almost exact clone of the thread controller. So I'm not sure if you want me to show or just walk through this entire thing again. At this point, I think you should be able to just do it on your own, or quite honestly, just copy and paste the thread controller and change all the things that says replies to threads, as well as TS to RS, because I don't think there's an actual change in any of this. Yeah, let's just quickly scroll down. So this is list replies. Oh, there is one small change. We're getting the TID param. Other than that, we're going through the same flow in that validate all of our parameters and or body request, send it into the service, and then based on the response or the return type of that service, we'll send an error or the JSON reply or response. So list is here, the get is here, create is also here, but now with the thread ID. So that's different. And then report as well as delete. So all in all, not too different, very similar to the thread controller. So I don't really want to go over it just because it'll be busy work for both me and you. But now that we have the controller and the service done, we go back to our routes and finish out our register reply routes down here. The first thing is we could uncomment out the reply controller because now it exists. We can get rid of this print line and uncomment out these. The difference here is that we changed the names from threads to replies, so 1 second. There we go. So that's a quick fix. And then now that we have this method, we can go into our main file, so main.go, and create our new service and controllers, and then finally register it. So rs is services.new reply service, which needs the connection. rc is the new reply controller, which takes in rs, and then we can call register reply routes, passing in rc. And this is because I forgot to change the router interface. So that goes here inside of the router.go file, the register reply routes, which needs the controllers.reply controller, and that will fix our main.go file, and our application is complete. So with that, make sure that you have your database up, and we're gonna do a go run main.go to run through the entire application in a HTTP client of some sort. I'll be using Insomnia, but before we do that, it is good to validate that we have all of the routes at the right places. I got confused. The health check is up here. It's before the migration for some reason, so alright, cool. Yeah, okay. This is where we left off last time. So before we do anything, let's check our health check, and this should just give us an okay. Or we get a 404, which technically exists. I wonder if it's because of the slash. Yeah, okay, that's a little strange, but whatever. Now I cleared my database, so I have to do the entire threads flow again. So empty, we do a post. There's the first one. Let's make a couple. So 2, 3, and 4. Let's do a put to number 2, and put is going to change the reported. So false is now going to be true, but we have to go do the get to see it. Now if we do a delete, that'll change the text here to deleted because it's a soft delete. Success is true, so we have to do a get to see it again. Now let's test out our replies. So that's replies, and we need the thread ID, so I'll provide 2 right now. Actually, let's go to 3, and this should be an empty array. Cool. So let's do a post, which does the create. Now the important thing here is that the thread ID that comes back is the same one as the parameter that we provided. So if we were to do a get to all the threads, we should see the third one being on top because we updated the bump date and it has the list of replies. But it also means that if we do replies at thread with the UI with the ID of 4, we should still get an empty array, which we do. So let's do a post here, and now let's provide the reply ID. So this one, it's just 3, and do a put. So this is going to change the reported value. So if we do a get, it'll get reported as true. And then finally, if we do the deletes, there's our success, and the final result is deleted. And then finally, just to check our threads to make sure that the bump date is still intact, we're expecting thread 4 to be the first one in the list now, which it is. And we also have the list of it. And then if we scroll down to thread 2 and 1, get rid of my face, these aren't showing replies because it's empty. So there's our omitted true, or omit empty, I think is called. So we know that our API works. And here you can see all the routes being triggered as we hit all of them. But let's kill the server because there's one more feature that I want to implement, and you can kind of see this as a review of the entire application because we're going to start all the way in the config. So let's open up local.yaml, and we're going to add another configuration for under the app config, but this is going to be the API key. Now because we're using the local YAML, it doesn't need to be something super secret, so we'll just call it my secret key. But the one that you do want to keep secret is going to be whatever's inside of the prod.yaml, because that'll be the production configuration. So you can guess now that what we're going to do is add a very pseudo auth layer. This application's the anonymous message board, so it's not real auth, but we're doing a middleware, which will need another file for that. So middleware.go, and that's going to be part of the router or the routes package because you can apply middlewares to the gin router, and that's the kind of middleware that we're creating. So package routes, and this part is kind of new. A gin middleware function, and you need to return a handler function, which is kind of what we write in all of our controllers. So that's taking c.gin.context, and the context will be given to us and handled by the gin router, so we don't need to worry about where this comes from. Now to customize this, we're going to take two parameters. What this is it's going to be the XAPI key whatever as the param, and then the key is the actual password, so key secret or something. So that means we'll have an if statement in here that'll take something like as the attempt and check if it matches the key. And if it doesn't, we'll call abort with status JSON. And here we could call our utils.createAPI that we've been using. Now, I don't know if I've actually explained this previously. I probably should have, but the reason why we return a tuple from create API error here is because all the gin methods needs two parameters. So when you call it like this, it'll spread it out into the method like that. This will be http.status unauthorized, and then the message will be invalid API key. Now we still need to get this attempt from somewhere, and we can get it from the gin context by going into the request.header, and we're getting param. Now param is whatever we're specifying as the API key parameter. So this is where you put the X API key thing. Now another thing that you need to keep in mind when creating a gin middleware is that if all of this is okay, we need to call the next portion of the middleware, which is hopefully our handler function inside of a controller. So we just have to do c.next at the end. And importantly, this time we don't call return because we're actually going into the next function. So we need to let that do its thing. Now next we need to use this API key, and we're gonna go into routes for this because we're gonna create another register function. And now I can kind of tell you what this feature is. We're creating an admin route. I'm not gonna worry about the controller yet because we'll do that immediately after this, but I do want to show how to add the middleware. So first we need a router group, and we'll just put it at /admin here. And then to get the API key, luckily the router has the C property, which is the config. So we could just do a get here, and that'll give us the config. Then we do get string, providing the path to the API key in our config, which is app.api key. And let's just assign that to a variable called API key. Next we can call rg, which is the router group, use, and then pass in our middleware of API key, where you specify whatever parameter you want inside of your header, which I'll just call X API key because I think that's the convention. Don't quote me though, I don't know for sure. But the value is whatever comes from the config, so that'll be the API key inside the variable. So we need to create a new admin controller, but before that we need to update our services with the method that we want to use. And in this case, all of our resources already have read access to everything. So I was thinking that for an admin of our application, they would just need the ability to delete without providing a password. But that takes in an ID for the thread, and we could just copy everything from the original delete with password, except get rid of the password checking. Alright, we need to add the return type of an error, and also add this E to make sure that we're typing it correctly. So let's add this to our interface, delete ID string error. Now we need to do the same thing for the reply service. So reply service, we'll add our delete without the password, so basically the same thing. Go to the bottom, I'm just gonna copy this, paste that here, change this to delete, get rid of password, and get rid of the password check. Now that we updated our service, we can now consume these new methods inside of a new controller that we're creating called the admin controller.go. Package controllers. So the same pattern of the interface, then the struct, then the constructor. The new thing here is that we're taking two dependencies, and that's because we need both of them. We're not making a new service called admin service because these services are, you kind of think of them as tied to the data model, whereas the controller is tied to the routes. So there's a little bit of a disconnect, but it still is connected together in a way that makes sense. Then we just need to add the delete thread and delete reply methods, both of which will take in the gin context. This part should not be too different. We're taking the parameter for the exact ID for the thread. We'll call the delete by calling the thread service inside of the admin controller. And then we'll do the error or success rendering, JSON rendering, that we've done in the previous controllers. And then we'll do the same thing for reply. And this time it's the same thing, except the only change is we change the service that we're calling. So now that we have both of these methods on our controller, we can go back to the route registration and then add them here. That we need to provide controllers.admin controller here. And now that's complete. And then the final step, of course, is to go back into main. We don't need to make a new service because we're reusing these two. We just need to make a new controller here. So new admin controller, where we provide both the thread service and the reply service. Kind of important to note that the order matters here, and then finally we need to call register admin routes AC. And I keep forgetting to update the router interface. So let's do that. C controller, admin controller. Okay, that should be it. Now we can exit this, do a go run main, and at the very bottom we have two new delete routes, which we're gonna test out. So back in Insomnia, we have all of our threads here. Let's go do number one. So over here, we'll change threads here to admin and do a delete, and we get no route found, which oh right, I have to, it's admin/threads. Okay, threads. Now if we do a send, we get invalid API key, and that's because we need to add a header of X API key, and what did I say it was? My secret key. There we go. So success true. Now if we do threads of 1, we should see deleted, and we didn't provide a password, so oops, we did. Okay, what else do we have? We have 4. Yeah, let's do 4. So admin / and we go do a delete. Make sure that there's no query of password, but we have the header of my secret key. Do a send, we get success. If we do a get to /thread, so remove the admin part, this is correct. Now let's delete reply of 2, which is this one. So replies to admin, and this is a delete. All right, and then if we do a get, we have to provide the parent, the reply ID, and then get rid of the subroute of admin. And now this should say deleted. So we effectively added a pseudo auth route to our API using a API key header authentication method, and our application is now complete. So I hope you enjoyed this. We did quite a bit, and I hope that you found it valuable and understand Go with the Gin framework and Gorm database layer a little bit more. But yeah, as always, I'll see you all next time.